Well, welcome back to MedTech Crossroads. I think this is the longest number of weeks that we haven't had a show back to back. I think there were some times when I had 1 week missing, maybe two. We've been gone for 3 full weeks. I was very much not well. I hope you don't hear me sniffling or hacking too much today, but feeling so much better. So thank you for many of you sent wishes and just like, wow, it's been gone a long time, Gene. So thank you so much for reaching out, those of you who did. Really appreciate it. We're looking forward to today's show. It's going to be a lot of fun, lots to talk about, lots of new events to tell you about, lots of news from the FDA, and a very special trip I got to take before I got sick out to DC with Stephen Rapundolo of MichBio and Desiree Mowry from Stryker. We got to go into Capitol Hill and meet with every single one of Michigan's congressional delegations to tell them all about what the MedTech industry is up to and what is of concern to the MedTech industry. So it's very, very interesting. Can't wait to tell you about it coming up next on MedTech Crossroads. Well, as always, I want to tell you the upcoming events in the local and national ecosystem. And if you remember about Christmas time, oh my goodness, we could predict the entirety of 2023 because no one had their calendars out yet. And now we are at a point where, we're going to tell you about what's happening in April, and that'll pretty much cover it. And then we'll get on to May and June later because the calendars are filling up. We like to call these events from things from MEDC, from MichBio, Project MedTech. Ann Arbor Spark provides quite a few, and the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society as well as telling you about things directly from the FDA because they have in-person events, they have webinars, they have all sorts of cool things happening. So coming up here, let's talk about the 2023 Machine Learning Conference. This is a local event. We're going to see if we can get our clicker to work. I'm sorry we didn't get to report on it the last 3 weeks, but I think registration is closed, but it is happening April 1st. I think that's tomorrow, in person at Eastern Michigan University. I suppose if you desperately wanted to get there and you hadn't been registered yet, you could probably email Dr. Kalin there at okalin@emish.edu. And that's cool because we're going to be talking about machine learning today. Once again, FDA is in the news for AI ML. Another local event coming up Tuesday, April 4th, the Ann Arbor Biosocial, 5 p.m. at Pretzel Bell, downtown Ann Arbor. If you're watching online, there's a QR code you can scan, presented by Ann Arbor Spark, MichBio, and MyLead. It's a great place to meet the local community. I was just telling somebody the other day they were looking for what their next job might be, and I said you gotta connect with people at these kind of events. So there's a local event coming up. Going all the way back out to national level, the organization RAPS is putting on a U.S. Regulatory Essentials for Devices on Tuesday, April 4th. So you can go learn all about regulatory essentials for medical devices. Of course, we love to talk about that here, but this will be a great event. And if you're interested, you can join that by scanning the QR code or going to raps.org. This has become a recurring event. The second Tuesday of every month, MichBio is hosting Bio Connections, and they're doing IP and legal expert virtual coffee break. So it's about a half hour, 11 o'clock. Every second Tuesday to get to talk to lawyers about the kinds of issues that you're facing. So that's a really cool thing. Apparently it's worked out pretty well because they're doing it again. And next up, the 10X Medical Device Conference. The 12th one of these, April 11th through 13th in San Diego, California. And this conference bills itself as a more fun one. It's not all about dry stuff. It's really networking with your colleagues. Well, that's cool. 10X Medical Device Conference, April 11th through 13th, and also happening on April 13th. Ann Arbor Spark. I had to call this one out because this isn't MedTech specific, but it's so important that I think if you're a startup and you're an entrepreneur and you're thinking about these things, and you're anywhere within striking distance of Ann Arbor Spark, you should probably think about this. April 13th, the Customer Discovery Event Series. You've heard us talk about it on this show so many times. Customer discovery doesn't help anybody if you build the wrong product. If no one wants it, it's not going to be of any use. And so they're talking about that, about all product types, about all service types. How do you find your customer? FDA also on April 13th has an event coming up. It's a webinar called Marketing Submission Recommendations for a Predetermined Change Control Plan for Artificial Intelligence / Machine Learning Enabled Device Software Functions Draft Guidance. Steve, do I need to say that again? That was quite the long title.
That was quite the mouthful there.
Yeah. I think we can, for all the improvements that FDA has made, we could ask them to think a little bit about their naming. I think that might be that count as a paragraph, not a title.
What they need is an acronym. Everything needs acronyms.
Everything needs an acronym.
That solves the problem. Just give it a big acronym, and we're good.
It's right. It's getting an acronym, and then you have to not pronounce the acronym like it looks, just to double confuse it. This is great. Wow, we should tell the FDA this. Anyways, marketing submission recommendations for change control plans. We're going to be talking about change control plans today for AI, ML, enabled device software. And if you want to hear about it from the horse's mouth, that would be April 13th, the webinar from FDA directly. Then this, April 18th, risk management for the full product lifecycle. So if you want to learn about risk management from RAPS, you can do that. That is in person in Rockville, Maryland. So maybe not for everybody, but it is happening. Also, April 18th, the pitch competition for the Spark Bootcamp. Wow, this is a venerable institution in our ecosystem. The Spark Entrepreneurial Bootcamp celebration with pitch competition happening. If you'd like to get connected to local startups, entrepreneurs, this would be a great place to show up. And then cybersecurity unauthorized. Well, I guess that's what it is when you're doing cybersecurity. You're trying to stop the unauthorized people. Thursday, April 20th and Friday, April 21st in Rockville, Maryland at the RAPS Global Headquarters. I plan to be at this MedCon in Columbus, Ohio, April 24th through 27th. FDA co-sponsors this conference along with RAPS as well as another organization. And this is usually a really good one to really connect, not just with your peers, but with regulators. And so a very, very important conference in the ecosystem. Those of you in the Michigan ecosystem, not too far away. Well, and speaking of artificial intelligence, there's going to be a free program. It's a webcast, The Foundations of AI, a non-technical introduction for regulatory affairs professionals. I think it's also for managers as well, if I remember from the comments below. But this company, Schlafender Hasse, did I get that right? Oh my goodness. Should have practiced that one. They are putting this on through RAPS. And if you want a non-technical introduction to artificial intelligence, this might be for you. Finally, on May 15th through 25th, there's a series of 3 workshops, 510Ks and de novos, IDEs, and pre-market authorizations put on by Advamed. So if you would like to deep dive into any of those will be happening virtually May 15th through the 25th. I think that's all the events for this week. We're going next, FDA News. Cybersecurity. How do we protect people from malicious invasion through digital methods? It's really important. There's a lot of places where things have gone wrong and will continue to go wrong. And so FDA is addressing it. And the list of documents and guidances and directives that they've issued, we are not going to cover that today. But here's a document that came out relatively recently, along with additional legislation that happened. And FDA calls out that the increasing integration of wireless, internet, and network-connected capabilities for devices, well, it creates all sorts of issues. We're going to see if we can get our drawing tools up here. For some reason, they have disappeared. And of course, it's always during the show that the technology completely fails. So we're just going to try to fix this here. For those of you watching online, you can watch me do a dance with my tablet here, which is not cooperating. For those of you who are just listening, you're just like, what on earth? What's going on here? Well, we're apparently going to be doing this without our usual tools, unfortunately. Oh, there it comes. We got it back. Thanks for your patience, folks. Gotta love the technology. Well, and I guess it's appropriate because we're talking about cybersecurity. We're talking about how digital devices fail. FDA says with the increasing integration of wireless, internet, and network-connected capabilities, portable media. I remember portable media going back 20 years. People were worried about that. Thumb drives, just stealing information and injecting things into computer systems. And frequent electronic exchange of medical device-related health information. The need for robust cybersecurity controls has become more important. Yeah, no doubt. There's a lot of threats to the ecosystem through cybersecurity attacks. And so FDA is saying, and this guidance applies, this guidance document is applicable to devices that contain software, including firmware, including programmable logic, as well as software as a medical device, SAMD. But they also say the guidance is not limited to devices that are network-enabled or contain other connected capabilities. They think that this applies to pre-market notifications, 510Ks, de novo requests, PMAs, as well as a few other things, including IDEs and humanitarian device exemptions. Because what has FDA done? FDA has said, you're going to consider cybersecurity. They cite the WannaCry ransomware attack. I almost did a Bugs Bunny. The WannaCry ransomware attack that happened earlier. There were other ones as well. They say that in 2020, a ransomware attack on a German hospital highlighted the potential impacts due to delayed patient care when a cybersecurity attack forced patients to be diverted to another hospital. So they were going to take them to the hospital, and they had to actually change location because they couldn't receive them there. Now they talk about this thing called a secure product development framework. It's a set of processes that help to reduce the number and severity of vulnerabilities in products. Now, if you ask me, that sounds a lot like risk management. It sounds a lot like thinking about what needs to happen ahead of time, making requirements, making mitigations, having plans in place. So at some level, an SPDF, while it sounds like a new thing, a secure product development framework, while it sounds like a very new thing, it really is an application of the same kind of principles that have always been part of medical device development, just in a specific context here for software development. Now, we're not going to go through all of this, but some of the things that they cite are like security objectives. How are you going to authenticate users and the integrity of that authentication? Are you authorized to use what you're trying to use? Is the service actually available? Is it confidential appropriately? And can it be updated and patched in a timely fashion? Now, those of you who are used to developing medical devices will note that what they say next is not new. They say that you need to meet these objectives, and it depends on the device's intended use and indications for use, the presence and functionality of its electronic data interfaces. You have to know how the data is getting in and getting out. You have to think about the intended and actual environment of use. The type of vulnerabilities present. That sounds an awful lot like a risk analysis, doesn't it? How exploitable the vulnerabilities are. What's interesting about that one is that while in most of medical device development, we have to think about reasonably foreseeable misuse, in this case, we're actually thinking about reasonably foreseeable intentional misuse, right? Where somebody says, I want to hack into this. Finally, the risk of patient harm due to vulnerability exploitation. So none of this is really that new, except the addition of the idea that somebody might really intentionally try to harm somebody by hacking in. But otherwise, this is a reframing or a reformatting of the kinds of things that we've always cared about in medical device development. Now, they do talk also about third-party software components, but I don't want to spend too much more time taking you through all the details of this. I am going to show you the table of contents of this, just to show you what they walk through. And if you're working with a project that involves cybersecurity, and hey, if you've got a microprocessor in your medical device, guess what? You're probably working with a project that involves cybersecurity. So let's just go through these really quick. They want you to do security risk management, which includes threat modeling, analysis of the third-party software components, security assessment of unresolved anomalies, security risk management documentation, and that TPLC security risk management. And there's an architecture step. Security controls, security architecture views, global system view, multi-patient harm view, updatability and patchability, and security use case views. And there's cybersecurity testing, cybersecurity transparency, which includes labeling recommendations and vulnerability management plans. It's a lot of stuff that if you've been developing your device with a microprocessor in it, and you suddenly come across this and have to do it, you got some work to do. When do you have to do it by? Oh, March 29th. Whoa, wait. What's today? Hey, Steve, what's today?
I believe today's the 31st.
Oh, good. So we're 2 days late now. We have to have this all done by March 29th. That's why FDA has taken another step here. They have said, they issued just the other day, March, I think it was yesterday. I think it was March 30th. They issued this document, and they basically said, hold up, this isn't happening yet. Because apparently a lot of people are having trouble implementing this quickly. They note that they have the Section 524B that was part of the new legislation. They basically get down here and say, you've got to do these things. You've got to make this part of your submission. You've got to make sure that we have this. Now, if you've been listening to the show for very long, you know that when you submit something like a 510K, FDA is going to give you, they're going to go through what's called a refuse to accept checklist. Guess what's now included on that refuse to accept checklist? Cybersecurity. So if you don't think about cybersecurity and you send them a 510K, you don't have the cybersecurity sections filled in. As of 2 days ago, you were going to get a RTA, a refuse to accept, saying you didn't do anything on cybersecurity. As of yesterday, what they're saying, and here it is down here, for pre-market submissions submitted for cyber devices before October 1st, 2023, FDA generally intends not to issue or refuse to accept decisions. So, what does this mean? It means that if you are submitting a 510K, a de novo, a PMA, an IDE, prior to October 1st, they're not going to refuse to accept it. That doesn't mean you're getting through without cybersecurity. It just means that they're not going to kick it back in your face immediately. So this is really high urgency stuff. Basically, you've got the summer to get this sorted out, to make sure that your cybersecurity strategy is in place. So FDA just came back with that. Fortunately, there is a lot of material out there. MITRE, MITRE.org, has an entire thing about applying what's called CVSS to cybersecurity. Um, and it's got some wonderful flow charts in it and things like this, like question 1, can the attacker utilize some type of network or communication protocol to exploit vulnerability? If the answer is no, well, do they have to have physical contact with the device? If the answer is yes, then you do this and ask this question and so on and so forth. So it's a very, at some level, this is nothing other than the kinds of risk analysis that have been done for years on medical devices. But there's certainly a lot more paths to follow. There's more flowcharts to go down to think, how could this be compromised? And that's what FDA is expecting. They're giving a little grace. It's not this week that they're saying we're booting you out the door if you don't have it, but it is coming October 1st. So get that in place fast. That's all about cybersecurity. Let's talk next about AI ML. It's a fascinating topic. We know lots of folks who are working on artificial intelligence and machine learning. And this is this change control plan thing. This is where the focus is today. Predetermined change control plan, PCCP. PCCP. Predetermined change control plan. Here's how it's going through my head. And for those of you who are online and not just listening to this, I think of it sort of this way. There's a whole bunch of data out there in the world, and you don't want to have to validate every single data point. So you make a model, and you train that model on data, and you've got training data, you've got tuning data that goes along with it, and then you eventually test the model, save some of your data back, and try the model against it. And so you create this model, or we could think of it as like a function. And you make your model, and that's cool. But here's the problem. That model gets frozen. That line right there gets frozen. All the data goes away, and you send it out into the wild, and now people can use this model. But where's the promise of artificial intelligence and machine learning? Isn't it supposed to be predictive and say all sorts of cool things that it's never seen before? It's not how FDA models are. They get frozen, they get locked down. And the question really becomes, what if we have data points that are out here? Well, FDA still, even with this predetermined change control plan philosophy, isn't saying you can extrapolate. They're not saying you can extrapolate. They're saying, what if we needed to change this model a little bit? What if we needed to maybe come in here and erase a little bit here and modify the shape of this function that we've got? That's what predetermined change control plans appear to be all about here. They talk in this document what's part of that predetermined change control plan. And this is a beautiful document because they talk not only about what these things are, but they give examples. So we're going to talk through a few examples. I'm not even going to spend much time on the document itself. Again, the title of the document is Marketing Submission Recommendations for a Predetermined Change Control Plan for Artificial Intelligence / Machine Learning Enabled Device Software Functions. While I'm reading some of the examples, Steve, you're going to come up with an acronym for that, I think, because we need it. We just have to have it simply. The definitions that FDA uses here before we jump into the examples, they talk about device software functions, machine learning enabled device software functions. Those are software functions that implement a machine learning model that was trained with machine learning techniques. And they talk about data sets, training data, tuning data, as well as testing data. But once you've got this algorithm frozen, they also want you to be thinking now about predetermined change control plans. Because under normal circumstances, what would happen if you made a change to how your medical device works at such a fundamental level as to say, let's change the model? Well, normally that would be a new marketing application in most cases that are meaningful. But a predetermined change control plan allows you not to extrapolate from the data, but allows you to change that model, to modify it. So they define a PCCP, the documentation describing what modifications will be made to the MLDSF and how the modifications will be assessed. They have to include device changes that would otherwise require a PMA supplement, de novo submission, or new 510K notification. So the PCCP is saving you from having to do, for example, a new 510K. So it's pretty big. An authorized PCCP went through the device marketing authorization. So when you got your 510K, you also approved your PCCP. You know, this may be a stretch, but in the world of plastic injection molding, this is where I got my start. If we wanted to change something on a hardened steel mold, we'd make a little cutout in it, and we'd put an insert into that cutout. And that insert would do what we wanted it to do, but if we ever needed to change just that part of it, we had already defined an area that we could pull out and change the geometry. Maybe a hole wasn't big enough, so we had a way to pop it out and pop it back in. And that's really what they're doing here with PCCPs. They're asking ahead of time, what could change and how are you going to validate it? Saving you from having to submit a new 510K or a new de novo or a new PMA, et cetera, et cetera. So there's other things that go on there, but let's look at some of these examples. They've got patient monitor software as an example. So they've got a patient monitor that detects patterns that occur at the onset of physiologic instability. Cool. And it generates an audible alarm signal. So I've got a patient monitor, generates an alarm signal. When you need to have prompt clinical action to prevent potential harm to the patient. So the manufacturer says, hey, this is great. I've got my product out there, but I'd like to retrain the machine learning model with more data to reduce the false alarm rate. False alarm rate is what they're trying to get rid of, while maintaining or increasing sensitivity. So I want this thing to be more sensitive, but scream at us less. That sounds good. So they'd like to increase the sensitivity. They have a plan for how to do it. Here's two scenarios. The first modification scenario, they are going to collect data in accordance with the modification protocol, retrain the ML model, and they're going to test it per the methods specified in the modification protocol. They get the results that they're looking for. They update the labeling. They communicate with device users. All of this presumably part of the plan. Because the device modification was specified in the PCCP and it was implemented in conformance with it, it would not require a new marketing submission. So that's pretty cool. Just saved a brand new 510K. That's really cool. But scenario two, what if they, with their modification protocol, retrained their model? And what if it has the same false alarm rate and sensitivity as the previous version? But they noticed that it maintained the sensitivity and can now do something that it couldn't do before. It can predict physiologic instability in advance of its onset. So it's before the instability happens, it can predict it, which the previous version could not do. So they want to say, hey, we can do this cool thing. That's great. We did more testing and we can demonstrate this. Can you do that? Nope, can't do that. Why? Well, because the PCCP didn't have that in the plan. It wasn't part of the plan that we were going to find new intended uses for the device. So a new marketing submission would be required. It really is like cutting a hole out in a piece of metal and sticking a new piece in, I tell you. How about this skin lesion software? So it's analyzing images of skin lesions, this device, by analyzing color, quantification of area change over time to aid in diagnosis. Cool. It was validated with a specific camera and it had a PCCP. But they want to extend this. They want to use this with, iPads and Androids and smartphones and tablets instead of a specific camera that was developed with this. They want to use a general purpose computing platform. Well, that's cool. And they can do that because they have minimum specifications in the PCCP. And off they go. So here's two scenarios. Scenario one, they analyze and validate that the machine learning can be deployed on 2 additional smartphones that have image acquisition specifications that meet the minimum Okay, so you met your specs. Like, we're going to use that. It was statistically equivalent to the baseline performance. Good job. Labeling was updated. Cool. People always forget about labeling. Labeling is an easy one to forget about. So they update their labeling. They update communications on the devices. Good. Then it says, because the device modification was specified in the PCCP and it was implemented in conformance, the device modification would not require a new marketing submission. Congratulations, company. Very happy for you. Okay, but here's scenario 2. Let's talk it through. They want to deploy the modified model. They're going to sense skin lesions with their off-the-shelf cell phones. In this case, no, they want to use a thermographic camera. I'm sorry. In this case, they want to make changes so it's a thermographic camera. But the new camera technology was not specified in the PCCP. Oh, okay. So I want a camera, and how I specified it, I can find one. Cool. I want a camera, and how I specified it isn't the type of camera I actually want to use. Guess what? That's going to fall outside of the PCCP, so that a new marketing submission would be required. That's the sad news there. Here's the third scenario for the same one. The manufacturer would like to distribute a new version of the machine learning software that is patient-facing, not for use by a primary care doctor. So cool. You could do it, right? Analysis of physiological characteristics of skin lesions, as it does currently, and tells them to follow up with a dermatologist. The modification introduces many new unconsidered risks that were not yet mitigated in the current PCCP. Can anyone guess where this is going? But it wasn't included in the PCCP. Sorry, one second. And so it could significantly affect the safety or effectiveness of the device, and a new marketing submission would be required. Just one second. Wow, talking for the first time in 4 weeks is becoming a challenge. This is great. So they've got other examples. If you want to read this, it's on the FDA website. I won't go through the other examples here. But basically the point is this. If you have a PCCP, if you get your device cleared with a PCCP, you've still got to do the work. You just got to do it up front. You've got to say, here are the ways that we might want to change our device. And it's not, what's interesting about it? It's not just the model. It's not just the AI ML model. It's really saying, like, we want to change the hardware later. Okay, well, make sure your specification for that hardware is generic enough so that you're able to go back and reference that PCCP without having to file a new marketing application. So there's a lot more in this one. Definitely worth looking at if you have an AI ML device to understand when you can just charge forward and when you really should be thinking, oh, hold up. Yeah, we want to make this submission. But let's put all our future potential changes that we can think of in here to make our life easier down the road. And lastly, on the news, Diagnostic Data Program from FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration Diagnostic Data Program. This one caught my eye because there's been a lot of discussion, especially in the local ecosystem, about providing data, connecting data. There are two efforts underway. We'll talk about those briefly here. The wonderful thing, everyone can see that this should be a thing, right? That when data is collected on patients, wouldn't we like as a society to know in aggregate what's happening? We could learn so much. Oh yeah, only one problem. I don't really want my data shared. And it's a good thing. Things like HIPAA are out there to protect patient privacy. But now we're at cross purposes because society would really like to know how society is doing. And in theory, we don't care about exactly your data. But in reality, we would need your data to be able to move forward. Well, if data is de-identified, it's not necessarily a problem to share. That doesn't violate HIPAA. But they talk about the erosion of data accuracy as data is transferred between systems. So they've got two efforts here. One is called SHIELD, and one is called OTC POC. They also have, get this, extramural research happening with respect to both of these. So if you're interested in helping FDA solve any of these problems, there are pathways for this. But let's talk about SHIELD first. This is probably the larger of the two as I see it. They want to build, implement, and support a comprehensive solution that addresses clinical and semantic device interoperability of in vitro diagnostics, IVDs, across the nation. And when they say semantic, that's an interesting word because they're really talking about the language that is used for IVDs communicating. What do they communicate with? Who do they communicate to? Let's go down here a little bit lower. They've got some priorities up here, but I'm going to skip over that. And I want to look at a typical workflow. Again, this is provided by FDA. It's a nice little document. What we expect to happen is that you have some kind of lab device, an analyzer of some sort, DNA diagnostic or whatever else, that gets pushed into a laboratory information system. Then the electronic health records get updated, the EHRs. How many systems have we just jumped? That's the third system we're on, and we're not even all the way there. There are efforts to promote interoperability, which is great. And then the data consumer finally gets the data. Clinical researcher, FDA, healthcare provider, patient. And then they say this: unfortunately, laboratory data is simple to transmit, but tremendously challenging to manage and evaluate due to non-standardized encoding practices. Well, of course, because if I'm designing a novel device for diagnosing something, I'm going to design however I want to show you that data. That's pretty common. Oh boy, this is the challenge, right? It's amazing we ever got to things like JPEG for photos, right? And things like MP3s for audio. Even so, there's so many formats still. What does this actually look like? This is not happy. The laboratory analyzer goes to the laboratory information system. According to research, the actual data integrity is 59%. I can't tell you what 59% means in this case. It would be nice to know what they mean. I think what they mean is that when data gets there, either 59% of it is correct or it's only correct 59% of the time. Question mark, question mark, question mark as it goes through the next stages. The point that FDA is making here is that the single trip data integrity is 22 to 68%. That's a terrible percentage. They're saying that on average, less than half of the time the data is correct as it makes its way through this process. That's absolutely atrocious. And I think we think to ourselves, well, if I'm in a hospital and a doctor walks up to me and they give me a result, or a nurse walks up to me and they give me a result, I can trust that result. And what we're learning is, no, you can't necessarily, because it's already been through 3 or 4 systems. So they mentioned that there's no systematic application of codes by device manufacturers and data standards are not harmonized. How you organize, categorize, and store the results are different. There are existing standard interface specifications between IVDs and laboratory information systems, but they're not implemented consistently. So even the standards we do have, we don't use. There's no hierarchy of concepts in the primary laboratory data standard. So how do you want to organize it for your device? Well, okay, that'll be fine. No, it's not. Not for this kind of purpose anyways. And not all relevant and pertinent data elements are codified or even included in the current interface implementations. So this is a real problem. FDA is trying to address it. This kind of goes back to when we were talking the other week about fluid connectors, right? Air and fluid connectors, gas and fluid connectors for devices. It's almost the opposite problem, right? Here's a place where things don't work together but should. And with gases and fluids, we have this problem where things do work together that shouldn't, because we don't want to insufflate your lungs with saline. So it's a very interesting process. It's a place where FDA is reaching out for industry assistance as well. There's also this other side of it, OTC POC, over-the-counter point of care. Of course, COVID was the thing that really made this obvious, as people would say, well, what's happening in the world? And everyone would go, well, as best we can figure this, but no one actually knows. Oh, and by the way, all those over-the-counter tests we did, no one has a clue how many of those came back positive or negative. So just to know that over-the-counter and point of care is a point of interest too for FDA. And as I said twice already, but I'll say it one more time, there is extramural research that FDA is funding for these things. And if that's of interest to you, something to get connected with. I think that is our news for today. And next up, we've got a really cool special feature. That one is this, the MichBio Advamed Legislative Fly-In. There were actually 2 of them. I got to go on one of those with the, I was going to say inimitable, but my goodness, this guy is a machine. Stephen Rapundle of MichBio. We went all over Capitol Hill, Rayburn office building, Longworth, Cannon, back and forth and back and forth. I don't know how many miles I got in those 2 days, but we frequently had like 10 minutes between meetings, so we were just hoofing it between the buildings, and we were joined by Desiree Mowry from Stryker, who's their government relations person. Over the course of those 2 days, we had 15 meetings. There's all the business cards I took away from the day, and 15 meetings. Let's see, how many congressional delegations does Michigan have? Michigan has 13 congresspersons, and 2 senators. Cool, that's all of them. We went to every single one of their offices. I'm going to tell you what we talked about there, but the first time I got to do this was in 2016. The last time I got to do it was in 2016. And I remember being on Capitol Hill and just realizing we don't have a clue what's going on when it comes to what we think we know about how our government works, how it affects our daily lives as citizens, how it affects our daily life working in a particular industry. And that perception has not gone away over the intervening years, and having done this again now in 2023. Before I tell you what we talked about and my impressions of it, I'll show you just a few more pictures from the days that we were there. Walking through the halls, we were shocked to find this, and it just struck me so much I had to leave a picture of it. This is about a 5-foot tall K'NEX Ferris wheel. And how can you not take a picture of a 5-foot tall K'NEX Ferris wheel when it is presented to you? It must have been, this wasn't at a Michigan delegation. This was some other state. But my goodness, how can you not grab that? It must have been done by some kids who came through who were in the congressperson's district. But that was very striking. Also this, and I think it just goes to the fact that whatever your politics are, it doesn't really matter. Walk by somebody like AOC's office. Obviously, we weren't meeting with non-Michigan delegations, but just the amount of personal passion that people have for somebody who strikes them the right way, feels that they're fighting for them. It was really, really interesting to me. Just like the outside of her office just plastered with well-wishers. But again, just interesting little tidbits that we noticed walking around. As we met with these 15 Michigan delegations, the 2 senators and the 13 congresspersons, the topics of personal experience. So Stephen talked on some topics. Desiree talked on some topics. I found it interesting that as somebody who works in the medical device industry, I was able to speak on topics that I actually have firsthand experience with. And the congressional delegations really do care. They really do care to hear from constituents. We have a representative government, and they want to hear from people in their districts, primarily, who are dealing with certain issues. I found it interesting, too. One of the most common questions, and if you've been involved in government and politics, I suppose that what I'm saying isn't really all that interesting, right? Because you know how the system works. But for those of you who haven't been, one of the most common questions we would get is there a bill for this? Right? Because what the staff are doing is they're looking and saying, do my constituents care about something that's going through, or do we need to create something to go through? And which way do they feel about it? They're taking the pulse. And they actually care to do it. And that's the positive news. The positive news is they care to find out, who are you? How are you related to my district? And what do you think about bills on this topic? So that's the nature of the discussion that you have in these meetings. Each meeting was about between 15 minutes and a half hour. I suppose if I had to say that there's a negative to this process, it's that even with all this effort, the exact feelings and biases of the person that you're talking to, even if they're very, very high, or even if they're the congressperson themselves, they may or may not hit home. They may or may not get all the way to that next meeting that needs to be held where people are talking about what are we going to prioritize inside of our office. So on the one hand, it does restore my faith in how the system works at some level. But I also realize there's a lot of noise out there, such that one conversation one time probably isn't going to move the needle. It really is that repeated thing to your delegation saying, hey, we as a district care about this. So it's very interesting. The topics that I was able to speak on, because we've experienced these things, R&D tax laws. Now, this doesn't hit a company like Into Being directly, because we're not the ones doing the R&D. Sure, we do the R&D, but it's not our R&D. We're doing it for other people. And so startups, especially startups in the software field, are getting hit really hard these days by an amortization schedule. What does that mean? Well, it used to be that the IRS would let you deduct your expenses in the first year that you incurred them, your R&D expenses. Now they've pushed that out to 5 years. That means if a software company is starting to make just a little tiny bit of money, they're not even paying the bills, but they've started to make just a little tiny bit of money, they can't offset that with all the costs that they have expended to date. So if the company happens to go out of business a year later, they weren't given the maximum boost that they could have been. And would that have made a difference? Sometimes it does. So those taxes, being able to write them off quickly for a company that hasn't even made any profit, is something that does affect startups. Supply chain also, there's a thing called the CHIPS Act that's going around. But predictably, it focuses on high volume chips. Guess what? MedTech is not really high volume in a lot of ways. Automotive and computers and personal devices often get the outsized focus. So we were able to express to the delegations how even in our own business, we see sometimes that a microprocessor that we used to be able to get next day from one of the suppliers like DigiKey, it just isn't available. It might be a month out. It might be 2 months out. It might simply not be available. Of the many, many thousands of parts there, so few of them have been available. We also talked about, don't you think we should prioritize for medical technology access to these sorts of things? If I don't have the tablet that I wanted, well, I can wait. But if I don't have access to a medical device, that's a bigger problem, as we learned early in COVID. Also, we talked about raw materials. Raw materials that go into medical devices are really important to have around. And we as a community learned that in the last few years. FDA staffing is another issue. I think we reported on this show that FDA is now just sort of recognizing, they don't like it, but they're recognizing that their staff will likely come, stay for 2 years, and then leave. Well, if you're in the process of a submission to FDA that might take, a significant chunk of time, if you have staff leaving right in the middle of it, it's not going to go well. The next staff that come along are going to have different opinions, different ways of implementation. So this is a major problem. There were commitments made for hiring as a part of MDUFA, Medical Device User Fee Act, MDUFA 5. And so there was a lot of encouraging the congressional delegations to try to make sure that these commitments are kept so that FDA has the people they need to review the submissions that companies are putting in. And so it's something we've certainly experienced. We've watched staff turnover at FDA, and it doesn't make anybody's life easier. Finally, one of the aspects that I was able to speak to was CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Reimbursement, and FDA. They've historically had a disjoint. The one who's paying and the one who's clearing are not the same entity in the government. And so while FDA has made many strides on the breakthrough device pathway, they've made it possible to get clearances with a higher degree of focus, hopefully faster. It remains that when you have a breakthrough device, it often comes with no reimbursement code. There's no way to sell it. So if I've got a 510K, I've got a device, it's got a predicate, I've got a reimbursement code associated with it, and I can go on the market and sell it, even if it took me a little longer to get to the market. When I do a breakthrough device, it's novel. There probably isn't a reimbursement code for which this is going to fit directly. What do I do? There was a program out there that was going to give a little bit of automatic coverage for, I think it was 4 years after the FDA cleared a breakthrough device. This was repealed. It was an administration change sort of a thing. It was proposed late and repealed early. But as a result, while we talk a lot about breakthrough devices and how cool it is that FDA has this program and you can get through it kind of quickly, the reality is if you get out to that market and you can't sell it because you don't have a reimbursement code, you can't sell it. So what was all that acceleration for? And this becomes a problem that a lot of people were very interested to learn about as we spoke with them. So it was a good time on Capitol Hill. The Ferris wheel was not the highlight, but it was great to be with Stephen and Desiree to get to talk to all these delegations. I think overarching, as I said, my main takeaway was that these kinds of processes are important. Your representatives only know what they're told. And they actually really, it's amazing. They really, really want to hear from their constituents. They want to hear from people in the state, and more importantly, they want to hear from people in their district. And anyone can go talk to them. So if there are things that matter to you, I think it restores my faith that there are people there willing to listen. They're not going to change anything based on what you say to them, but they're actually out there listening. And I tell you what, if 50 people walk through the doors and say, hey, we really care about this in your district, I think they're going to care. And that was a very encouraging thing to see in DC. So thank you to MichBio and Advamed, who put on additional programming for that event in Washington at the beginning of March. Well, that is our coverage today of the Advamed fly-in. We're just going to take a minute here at the end of the show to thank you for being with us. Thank you for tuning in today. It was so good to see so many familiar names and faces. If anyone has an event that's coming up that you'd like us to get on the calendar, tell us about, any questions that you have, or anything happening in the ecosystem, we would love to hear from you. You're welcome. For those who are in the Zoom room, you're welcome to raise your hand if you would like to tell us anything that's going on. I'm just going to check also here on YouTube, in case there are any questions there. We would be happy to field anything that pops up. Give it just a second here. Not seeing any questions, but oh my goodness, so good to be back with you today. Hope you're enjoying it. We have started Spotify and Apple podcasts. We're a little bit backlogged, as you might imagine, on getting those up. So we will get those up in coming weeks, and then we're going to start working on that backlog of shows so that you can listen to these with better indexing when there's a topic that's of interest to you. So with that, thank you for being with us on MedTech Crossroads. Hope you have a wonderful, wonderful week. Spring might be here. We'll talk to you next time.